I guess one of the things as I was listening to the prior panelists, one of the things I want to do before I start is that I'm a second generation immigrant. Um, my mom and my dad, my mom's from Ecuador. My dad is from Dominican Republic. One of the reasons that I'm interested in this topic and I ended up studying this topic is at the age grew up in New York, Spanish Harlem, got pushed out of high school. At the time, I didn't think about it as pushed out, but dropped out of high school at 16, found my way back into school in Miami at Florida International University and University of Miami, which are HSIs, which are Hispanic Serving Institutions. So I just want to give a context to where it is that I'm talking about this and how Dr. Bondy and I are going to be approaching some of this. So I think I could share my screen. Let's see. Yep. And slideshow start. Where is that? I always have this hiccup. There we go. All right. So one of the things I like, how I like to start, or how we like to start these conversations, and oftentimes when I find myself talking to educators, but also policymakers, there's this idea of what we think about when it comes to education and safety. And when we think about more broadly, specifically to this presentation, is thinking about immigration and school safety and the idea of inclusion and diversity. But when we are in the reality of where we are today, we often disregard the idea of what I often talk about, and many of my colleagues talk about, is the idea of criminalization and the idea of school safety and surveillance and the role it has in terms of socialization and racialization of kids of color, and including the children of immigrants, with increasing school resource officers, increasing measures of target hardening that can range from security, but also, I don't know if this is going to be from the presenters. No, okay. So all those things are how I think about, how many of us think about the role of safety within schools and our response, especially after the idea and the idea of Columbine and school shootings in our nation. But with that being said, there's a long history of thinking about what does it mean to protect the school? What does it mean to ensure the safety and the learning environment? From when we talk about illiteracy laws during slavery, to American Indian boarding schools, to schools being taught within Japanese internment camps. This is a long history of thinking about the intersection of what we mean in terms of protecting schools from violence, but also ensuring the safety of students. When we think about where we are today, there's this idea of thinking about the growing immigrant population within our schools being a burden, but also a threat within our schools. And there's a lot of scholars who use that kind of term and use that way of thinking about the growing immigrant population within the United States, especially after the Hart-Celler Act of 1965. One of the things I'd like to, again, one of the things I'd like to highlight is the long history of how we think about protecting schools, and how is it that we think about the intersection of immigration and education in the United States. And this is a quote that a police chief had in New York City that reflects how is it that even today, how we think about the growing immigrant population and the children of immigrants within our schools, and how we think about how we need to protect them, but also the idea of the immigrant criminal myth, but also, even though there's a lot of research that talks about that immigration and immigrants does not increase or is not associated with crime and deviancy, there's still this perception. And this perception has been long time history in the United States of the growing immigrant population, even including in New York over time. So again, it's just providing a context, because I think for for many of us who are doing this kind of work, it's important to realize the historical contextual aspect of how we think about education, immigration, and safety, because we find it in our curriculum, we find it in our textbooks, we find it in the history and the historical history of relationships. Thinking about who is it that we're protecting from segregation to desegregation, who do we think about, who are the children we need to protect, and as well as who are the children that we need to teach and who are entitled to learn. So with that, I think it's an important topic and an important thing to raise, how we think about violence within our schools. Most of the work and most of the ways that people think about this in terms of schools but also policymakers and administration is thinking about individualistic behavior. And again, one of the things many of us like to bring up is the idea of context and history, and thinking about over time, how do we think about ensuring safety and addressing violence? And then we need to be thinking about violence. And many of us who are doing this kind of work have a very broad definition of what violence means, right? Which I think a lot of times gets mislabeled. So in other words, there's a long history of research, but also many people who I've come into contact within schools often think of violence as specifically crime, and crime defined at criminal behavior at the individual student level. But when we think about this as scholars, but also as what we try to refer to policymakers, is the idea of much broader conceptions of violence, right? From discrimination to harassment, prejudice, but also health and when we think about marginalization in the broader sense, the health and well-being of students must take prominence in all of this, right? So we think about violence as well as the increasing intersection of the juvenile justice system with the educational system. So some of the work that I've been doing with some of my colleagues in Texas, that there are a growing number of schools that have school district police departments. So these are school districts that have their own police departments, but it's also, there are a number of schools that are also having processing and juvenile justice processing occur on campus grounds. So in other words, how we think about not only arrest, but then even being waived over to the adult criminal justice system can occur on school grounds. So again, this is how we broadly think about and define violence, injustice, and inequality. On the flip side, or on the same coin, we have to think about what does it mean, what does safety mean, right? So there's particular ways of how we think about violence, and those are particular ways that we try to highlight when we talk to practitioners, teachers, administrators, and policymakers, what they need to be mindful of, but also how is it that we can think about safety? So it's not simply just individual students, but also thinking about the broader context, right? So thinking about the broader inequalities that a lot of students are coming into schools with, not only currently, but historically, when we think about communities and these schools embedded in historically these marginalized communities and under-resourced communities. We also have to think about, just beyond addressing and responding to crime or violence in a specific way, but also issues of restorative justice. How do we think about the health and well-being of students, ensuring that, ensuring healthy climates within schools, but also healthy relationships between teachers, students, administrators, policymakers, but also community stakeholders. The reason that this is so important to us in terms of our research is centered around how schools can be a site of progress and success, but it also can be a site of reproduction, stratification, and inequality. Again, when I think about what is it that I had to experience as a student, one of the first schools, attend a school with one of the first in New York to have multiple perimeters, gang tactical units coming regularly to school, ensuring the safety of school by increasing number of police officers, but also random searches. How is it that we think about the idea of potential students as the threat, as criminals, and does that facilitate their educational success and progress? And again, this is the site of the potential site of reproduction and inequality. And there's a lot of research that talks about not only high schools and middle schools being a pathway into thinking about college and thinking about access to employment, but also how this is a mechanism that could also facilitate entrance into the juvenile justice system, the adult criminal justice system, and ultimately incarceration. So the next thing I want to bring up is a shameless plug for our book that is out. So I'm going to be dropping a copy of this PowerPoint in the chat, and that'll be, and it's out already. So I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Dr. Bondy, at this point.
So Anthony and I are later going to look at the relationship and the roles of teachers and school resource officers. But briefly, I'd like to talk about the role of teachers within school safety. And I'd like to focus specifically on safety, justice, and equity and what teachers can do in their classrooms in terms of countering or ameliorating discrimination that the children of immigrants may experience, or the fear and isolation that the children of immigrants may experience in your classrooms. So as we know, what happens outside of schools and what happens in broader society can impact the students that come into our classrooms. So for example, the children of immigrants may be frightened or they may be uncertain because of broader anti-immigrant discourses or because of broader anti-immigrant practices that are happening outside of schools, and they can bring that into their classrooms. So some things that teachers can do to show their support, and I believe this has been touched upon by a number of the presentations today, you can check in with your students. We do this on a regular basis and we can normalize this. And even if students don't want to talk to us in the classroom, then there can be times that they can come to talk to us outside of the classroom. We can include information on bulletin boards. We can include information about resources for students. And if we don't want to sort of out a student, then we can regularly remind our students of the resources that are available in our classrooms for them to come and look at. If they don't want to look at it during class time, maybe there's times outside of that class when they can come and view the resources. We can also do things like display posters in our classrooms that represent inclusion, that represent diversity, so that there are visual reminders to students that when they come into our classroom, that this is a safe space. Some other things that we can do to create healthy classroom learning environments, to create a sense of safety and justice for our students, is we can use culturally responsive teaching. We know that students can respond when there are guest speakers that might share the same cultural identity, the same history as them, and so we can invite those kinds of speakers into our classrooms. We can also do things like pair dominant perspectives in the curriculum with more diverse perspectives. So when I taught history, that's what I would do in the classroom and look at what the standards had us do, and then introduce other materials so that my students were exposed to multicultural perspectives, if you will. We can also ask students what they would like to learn about, what social issues they're interested in, what's important to them, and we can incorporate that into our lesson plans, and we can make sure that various viewpoints are available. For teachers who are interested in not just a healthy classroom environment, but who are interested in creating healthy school climates, we can involve our colleagues. It is perfectly okay to request professional development that's related to school safety and immigration, to ask this of our administrators, to ask this of our school district. If we're unaware of what the impact of immigration enforcement is on our students, or if we're unaware of what policies are around deportation, then as teachers, you can request this information. Some other suggestions would be to create a professional network of justice-oriented teachers. But I also appreciate that teachers are overwhelmed, and time is a very, very precious resource. So there's also professional networks of justice-oriented teachers that you can join. And on the last slide, there are some resources that are available if you were interested in joining those.
So when it comes to school resource officers, there's I guess, again, I want to give some kind of background in who are school resource officers and SROs and what the ideal is supposed to be when we think about their presence at school I mean, they are ideally supposed to have these three roles, which is law enforcement officer, law-related counselor, and law-related educator. This is how their training goes. Ideally, when it comes to police officers who are supposed to be entering schools and ensuring the safety of all students. They are also presented as mentors and teachers when we think about their role in engaging with students, but also interacting with other school community members like teachers, parents, administrators, and all that. But the reality is something different, and this is something that has come up in a lot of research. Most police officers that are entering schools don't get specific training. So in other words, school resource officers, SROs, sometimes there's a national training that is supposed to be accredited in terms of all SROs are supposed to be getting when they start working at a school. But only a small fraction of those get that kind of accreditation. Usually what happens is law enforcement officer just becomes assigned to a school in terms of what they're patrolling in the area they're patrolling. So they often do not have a particular training when it comes to becoming a law enforcement officer within school. So what happens is that their approach to engaging with students is often one of enforcement and security and control. So this is something that a lot of research has talked about. So the way that they approach a problem or respond to an incident is one that reflects how they would do that out in the community and not necessarily think about the context to being within a school. When it comes to immigration and education and the role of SROs, one of the things that, again, one of my research, but a lot of my colleagues' research highlights is how they're being called into particular situations. Ideally, they're not supposed to be getting involved in disciplinary problems, but this is what's happening from teachers, administrators, staff. As soon as there's a problem, they're calling the SRO. So, but the way that has this unfolded, even though they're not supposed to be involved in these type of problems, it's that all the staff members, administrations are almost going initially whenever there's any kind of incident, even when it's one of just misbehavior, i.e. like chewing gum, and calling the SRO. One of the things also in particular districts, specifically when we think about immigration, there's been a construction, and again, a lot of us use the term of criminalization, is that there's a lot of research and evidence that suggests because schools are a site of assimilation, in many school districts, this is the idea. There are, I'll use the term criminalization, but then they identify even speaking non-English languages as a form of misbehavior. So oftentimes this will even involve SRs responding to those kinds of misbehavior incidents as constructed as misbehavior. So in other words, there are a number of school districts that have rules against speaking Spanish, for example, and then they have SROs respond to those kinds of incidents. Again, the idea of there's a lot of research and there's a lot of evidence. I guess it starts from students, teachers, staff, administrators, depending on the school district, have often used the idea of deportation or the threat of deportation, regardless of the student's citizenship status, as a way of social control and intimidation. So there's been a lot of students that have across the US that have reported bullying and harassment and threats of not only deportation of them, but they're using the threat of deportation of their family members, parents, siblings, so on and so forth. The reason that this is one thing if it was just, a threat and harassment, but what has been happening within the last 5 to 7 years is the increasing overlap of immigration, deportation, and surveillance within schools. So in other words, there's been an increasing presence of law enforcement being utilized, even though that is not within their jurisdiction or within their roles or responsibilities, of initiating an undocumented.
So I think Anthony was talking about the relationship between schools and deportation and the ways in which minor behavioral infractions can set students on a path to deportation when school resource officers get involved and when they're not adequately trained. And now my laptop is working, when they're not adequately trained in terms of being involved in a school. What I'd like to do now, and I think we have a few minutes, I don't know that we'll get to all of these questions. And if you all would like to type some of your responses in the chat, that would be wonderful. Some questions that Anthony and I wanted to discuss with everybody was the role of teachers and the role of school resource officers in schools. So the first question would be, do you think that we need school resource officers in schools? And if so, how should we integrate SROs within schools? I see a very emphatic no. Certain cities and around the country. That's a great question. If it's more likely to happen in certain areas of the country or in certain schools in certain areas of states, right? Given the amount of violence in schools or possibility, we do need school resource officers. What kinds of officers? School resource officers, SROs. Oh, that's wonderful to hear. There's one participant that there's a great relationship between the SROs and schools, and they're valuable in terms of ensuring the safety. Oh, some interesting comments. We need more counselors and not SROs. Thank you. So I think that the responses speak quite well to, it may depend on the school, it may depend on the context, where the school is located, what the demographics of the school are, what the relationship is like between the schools and the communities. And I think it was Martha Strickland who also shared a book regarding empowering families and the relationships between schools and families. So thank you for sharing that. And let's see if we can get to two more questions. This is an important one, I think. To what extent should teachers rely on school resource officers for misbehaviors? And Anthony, I see that you're back. So if you'd like to jump in, we're answering the third question in the chat. Training is everything. I see we need more counselors. They should be there to help just legal issues. That's a great point. Misbehavior is an opportunity to teach, not to punish. So that speaks to the relationship between teachers and school resource officers. Another important point, it can depend on the behavior of the student and whether or not an SRO officer should be involved. Another great important point, to involve SROs if the behavior puts people in danger, unless there is a law being broken. Speaking to the point that police are law enforcement and not there to enforce school rules. Dangerous behavior. Another important point, that early interactions can set students on a particular path, looking at the relationship between education and the criminal justice system and how the two are in fact related. Another great important point, SROs can have a great impact on students and can be a good role model. Important to look at representation of SRO officers, and they don't necessarily have to have a negative relationship with the schools. And Anthony, would you like to address the fourth bulleted question or another one that's on the list?
So I mean, especially how we're thinking about as communities and as communities, not only in the broader sense, but also school communities, how we think about, I mean, it is for sure that including SROs, and there continues to be a movement to have more presence of law enforcement within schools, but how do we think about the training, but also the role of school resource officers or SROs within schools is what's paramount, right? How do we think about integrating them within the school? More often than not, what the approach has been is just additive, right? And this is not necessarily thinking about the training and the relationships that are building that a lot of teachers have been trained to do in terms of the relationship with students. Is just that a lot of SROs haven't had that and don't even know how to do that, right? So that's where we have these unintended consequences, right? Of how is it that we think of law enforcement within schools, and how we've been socialized, all of us have been, if there's a problem, if there's some sort of occurrence, that we need to just call the police. But it's just how those things happen and what escalates from there. But also a lot of the research, what talks about is how is it that particularly the children of immigrants begin to believe and socialize that they are this immigrant myth and this idea, the immigrant criminal myth, is part of their education or becomes part of their education is what's problematic. So in making ensuring that and thinking about that in terms of how do we better integrate law enforcement and what are their specific roles. Because when we go into do this research within schools, a lot of them don't know. All they've gotten is as if they're responding to a call that's out happening in the community and not necessarily thinking about one, if they're engaging with youth and juveniles, especially ones under 12 and even including in elementary schools, but how this is a site of socialization and education, and how is it that they should be responding. So it's those kinds of things that are important to think about as what the last chat came in, this idea of being restorative. And I know we're over time, so now I would just want to say thanks to everybody. I'm going to drop this in the chat in terms of the presentation. So thanks again. I don't know if you wanted to say thanks, Dr. Bondy, but thanks for the invite.
Yes, thank you for the invite. I was typing in the chat, but yes, thank you very much.